Well, here we are. It is Sunday, November 13th, 2022. I'm Larissa, and we are reading John Steinbeck's To a God Unknown, Chapter 9. The year had darkened to winter, and the spring had come, and another fall before the marriage took place. There was term end to think of, and after that, in the heat of the summer, when the white oaks sagged under the sun, and the river shrank to a stream, Elizabeth had dealings with dressmakers. The hills were rich with heavy-seeded grain, the cattle came out of the brush at night to eat, and when the sun was up, retired into the sage-scented shade to chew sleepily through the day. In the barn, the men were piling the sweet wild hay higher than the rafters. Once a week during the year, Joseph went in to Nuestra Senora and sat in the parlor with Elizabeth, or took her driving in the buckboard, and he asked, "When will we be married, Elizabeth?" "Why, I must serve out my years," she said. "There are 1,000 things that must be done. I should go home to Monterey for a little. Of course my father will want to see me once more before I'm married." "That is true," Joseph said soberly. You might be changed afterwards." "I know." She clasped her hands around his waist and regarded her clasped fingers. "Look, Joseph, how hard is it to move the finger you want to move? You lose track of which is which." He smiled at the way her mind caught at things to escape thinking. "I'm afraid to change," she said. "I want to, and I'm afraid." "Will I get stout, do you think?" "All in a moment I'll be another person, remembering Elizabeth as an acquaintance who's dead." "I don't know," he said, edging his finger into a pleat at the shoulder of her shirtwaist. "Perhaps there isn't any change, ever, in anything. Perhaps unchangeable things only pass." One day she went to the ranch, and he led her about, boasting a little by implication. "Here's the house. I built it first. And at first there wasn't a building within miles, just the house under the oak tree." Elizabeth leaned against the tree and stroked its trunk. "There can be a seat up in the tree, you see, Joseph, where those limbs start out from the trunk. Will you mind if I climb the tree, Joseph?" She looked up into his face and found that he was staring at her with a strange intensity. His hair had blown forward over his eyes. Elizabeth thought suddenly, if only he had the body of a horse, I might love him more. Joseph moved quickly toward her and held out his hand. "You must climb the tree, Elizabeth. I want you to. Here, I'll help you." He cupped his hands for her foot and steadied her until he sat in the crotch from which the great limbs grew, and when he saw how she fitted into the hollow and how the gray arms guarded her, "I'm glad, Elizabeth," he cried. "Glad, Joseph? You look glad. Your eyes are shining. Why are you so glad?" He lowered his eyes and laughed to himself. "Strange things one is glad of. I am glad that you are sitting in my tree. A moment back I thought I saw that my tree loved you." "Stand away a little," she called. "I'm going up to the next limb so I can see beyond the barn." He moved aside because her skirts were full. "Joseph, I wonder why I hadn't noticed the pines on the ridge. Now I feel at home. I was born among the pines in Monterey. You'll see them, Joseph, when we go there to be married." "They are strange pines. I'll take you there sometime after we are married." Elizabeth climbed carefully down from the tree and stood beside him again. She pinned her hair and patted it with dexterous fingers that went inquisitively about, searching for loose strands and shaping them to their old course. "When I am homesick, Joseph, I can go up to those pines, and it'll be like going home." Chapter 10. The wedding was in Monterey, a somber boating ceremony in a little Protestant chapel. The church had so often seen two ripe bodies die by the process of marriage that it seemed to celebrate a mystic double death with its ritual. Both Joseph and Elizabeth felt the sullenness of the sentence. "You must endure," said the church, and its music was a sunless prophecy. Elizabeth looked at her bent father, where he glared at the furniture of Christianity because it insulted what he was calling his intelligence. There was no blessing in the leather fingers of her father. She glanced quickly at the man beside her, who was becoming her husband, second by second. Joseph's face was set and hard. She could see how his jaw muscles quivered tensely, and suddenly Elizabeth was sorry for Joseph. She thought with a little frantic sadness. "If my mother were here, she could say to him, 'Here is Elizabeth, and she is a good girl because I love her, Joseph, and she will be a good wife when she learns how to be. I hope you will get outside the hard husk you're wearing, Joseph, so you may feel tenderly for Elizabeth. That's all she wants, and it's not an impossible thing." Elizabeth's eyes glittered suddenly with bright tears. "I will," she said aloud and silently. "I must pray a little. Lord Jesus, make things easy for me, because I am afraid. In all the time I've had to learn about myself, I have learned nothing. Be kind to me, Lord Jesus, at least until I learn what kind of thing I am." She wished there were a crucifix someplace in the church, but it was a Protestant church, and when she drew a picture of the Christ in her mind, he had the face, the youthful beard, the piercing, puzzled eyes of Joseph, who stood beside her. Joseph's brain was tight with a curious fear. "There's a foulness here," he thought. "Why must we go through this to find our marriage? Here in the church I've thought there lay beauty if a man could find it, but this is only a doddering kind of devil worship." He was disappointed for himself and for Elizabeth. He was embarrassed that Elizabeth must witness the masculine entrance to the marriage. Elizabeth tugged at his arm and whispered, "It's over now. We must walk out. Turn toward me slowly." She helped him to turn. As they took the first step down the aisle, the bells broke forth in the belfry above them. Joseph sighed shudderingly. "Here's God come late to the wedding. Here's the iron God at last." He felt that he would pray if he knew some powerful way to do it. This ties in. This is the marriage, the good iron voice. And he thought, this is my own thing, and I know it. Beloved bells, pounding your bodies with your frantic hearts. It is the sun's sticks striking the bell of the sky in the morning, and it's the hollow beating of the rain on the earth's full belly. Of course I know. The thing that whips the tortured air with lightning, and sometimes the hot, sweet wind plucks at the treetops in a yellow afternoon. He looked sideways and down and whispered, "The bells are good, Elizabeth. The bells are holy." She stared up and peered up at him in wonder, for her vision had not changed. The Christ's face was still on the face of Joseph. She laughed uneasily and confessed to herself, "I'm praying to my own husband." McGregor, the saddler, was wistful when they went away. He kissed Elizabeth clumsily on the forehead. "Don't you forget your father," he said. "But it wouldn't be an unusual thing if you did. It's almost a custom in these days." "You'll come to the ranch to see us, won't you, Father?" "I visit no one," he replied angrily. "A man takes only weakness and a little pleasure from an obligation." "We'll be glad to see you if you come," said Joseph. "Well, you'll wait a long time, and you and your 1,000-acre ranches. I'd see you both in hell before I'd visit you." After a time he drew Joseph aside, out of hearing of Elizabeth, and he said plaintively, "It's because you're stronger than I am that I hate you. Here I'm wanting to like you, and I can't because I'm a weak man. And it's the same about Elizabeth and about her crazy mother. Both of them knew I was a weak man, and I hated both of them." Joseph smiled on the saddler and felt pity and love for him. "It's not a weak thing you're doing now," he observed. "No," McGregor cried. "It's a good, strong thing. Oh, I know in my head how to be strong, but I can't learn to do it." Joseph patted him roughly on the arm. "We'll be glad to see you when you come to visit." And instantly McGregor's lips stiffened in anger. They went by train from Monterey and down the long Salinas Valley, a gray and gold lane between two muscular mountain lines. From the train they could see how the wind blew down the valley toward the sea, how its dry force bent the grain against the ground until it lay like the coat of a sleek-haired dog, how it drove the herds of rolling tumbleweeds toward the valley mouth, and how it blew the trees lopsided and streaming until they grew that way. At the little stations, Chular, Gonzales, and Greenfield, they saw the grain teams standing in the road, waiting to store their fat sacks in the warehouses. The train moved beside the dry Salinas River with its broad yellow bed, where blue herons stalked disconsolately over the hot sand, searching for water to fish in, and where now and then a gray coyote trotted nervously away, looking back apprehensively at the train, and the mountains continued on with them on either side, like huge, rough outer tracks for a tremendous juggernaut. In King City, a small railroad town, Joseph and Elizabeth left the train and walked to the livery barn where Joseph's horses had been stabled while they were gone. They felt new and shiny and curiously young as they drove out of King City on the road to the Valley of Our Lady. New clothes were in the traveling baskets in the wagon box. Over their clothes they wore long linen dusters to protect them from the dirt road. And Elizabeth's face was covered with a dark blue veil, behind which her eyes darted about, collecting data from memory. Joseph and Elizabeth were embarrassed, sitting shoulder to shoulder and looking ahead at the tan road, for it seemed a presumptuous game they were playing. The horses, 4 days rested and full of fat barley, flung their heads and tried to run, but Joseph tightened the brake a little and held them down, saying, "Steady, Blue, steady, Pigeon. You'll be tired enough before we get home." A few miles ahead they could see the willow boundary of their own home stream where it strode out to meet the broad Salinas River. The willows were yellow in this season, and the poison oak that climbed into the branches had turned scarlet and menacing. Where the rivers joined, Joseph pulled up to watch how the glittering water from Nuestra Senora sank tiredly and disappeared into the white sand of its new bed. It was said the river ran pure and sweet under the ground, and this could be proved by digging a few feet into the sand. Even within sight of the juncture, there were broad holes dug in the riverbed so the cattle might drink. Joseph unbuttoned his duster, for the afternoon was very hot, and he loosened the neckerchief designed to keep his collar free from dust, and removing his black hat, he wiped the leather headband with a bandana. "Would you like to get down, Elizabeth?" he asked. "You could bathe your wrists in the water, and that would make you cool." But Elizabeth shook her head. It was strange to see the swathed head shake. "No, I am comfortable, dear. It will be very late when we get home. I am anxious to go on." He slapped the flat lines on the horses' buttocks, and they moved on beside the river. The tall willows along the road whipped at their heads and sometimes drew a long plaint switch caressingly over their shoulders. The crickets in the hot brush sang their head-piercing notes, and flying grasshoppers leapt up with a flash of white or yellow wings, rattled a moment through the air, and dropped to safety in the dry grass. Now and then some light blue brush rabbit skittered in panic off the road, and once safe, perched on its haunches to peek at the wagon. There was a smell of toasting grass stems in the air, and the bitter of willow bark, and the perfume of river bay trees. Joseph and Elizabeth leaned loosely back against the leather seat, caught in rhythm of the day and drowsed by the pounding hooves. Their backs and shoulders supplely absorbed the vibrations of the buckboard. Theirs was a state close to sleep, but more withdrawn to thoughtlessness, more profound than sleep. The road and the river pointed straight at the mountain now. The dark sage covered the higher ridges like a coarse fur, except in the water scars, which were gray and bare, like healed saddle sores on a horse's back. The sun was quartering to the westward, and the road and the river pointed to the place of its setting. For the two riding behind the plodding horses, clock time dissolved into the inconsistent interval between thought and thought. The hills and the river pass swept toward them grandly, and then the road began to ascend, and the horses hunched along stiffly, pounding the air with heads that swung up and down like hammers. Up a long slope they went. The wheels grated on shattered flakes of limestone, of which the hills were made. The iron tires ground harshly on the rock. Joseph leaned forward and shook his head to be rid of the spell, as a dog shakes water from its ears. "Elizabeth," he said, "we're coming to the pass." She untied her veil and laid it back over her hat. Her eyes came slowly to life. "I must have been asleep," she said. "I, too. My eyes were open, and I was asleep, but here is the pass." The mountain was split. Two naked shoulders of smooth limestone dropped cleanly down, verging a little together, and at the bottom there was only room for the riverbed. The road itself was blasted out of the cliffside 10 feet above the surface of the water. Midway in the pass, where the constrained river flowed, swift and deep and silently, a rough monolith rose out of the water, cutting and mangling the current like a boat prow dividing speedily upstream, making an angry, swirling whisper. The sun was behind the mountain now, but through the pass they could see the trembling light of it falling on the Valley of Our Lady. The wagon had driven into the chill blue shade of the white cliffs. The horses, having reached the top of the long foothill slope, walked easily enough, but they stretched their necks and snorted at the river far below them under the road. Joseph took a shorter grip on the lines, and his right foot moved out and rested lightly on the brake. He looked down on the serene water, and he felt a gush of pure warm pleasure in anticipation of the valley he would see in a moment. He turned to look at Elizabeth, for he wanted to tell her of the pleasure. He saw that her face had gone haggard, and that her eyes were horrified. She cried, "I want to stop, dear, I'm afraid." She was staring through the cleft in the sunlit valley. Joseph pulled up the horses and set the brake. He looked at her questioningly. "I didn't know. Is it the narrow road and the stream below?" "No, it is not." He stepped to the ground then and held out a hand to her, but when he tried to lead her toward the pass, she pulled her hand away, from him and stood shivering in the shade, and he thought, I must try to tell her. I've never tried to tell her things like this. It seemed too difficult a thing, but now I have to try to tell her. And he practiced in his mind the thing he must try to say. Elizabeth, he cried in his mind, can you hear me? I am cold with a thing to say and prayerful for a way to say it. His eyes widened and he was entranced. I have thought without words, he said in his mind. A man told me once that it was not possible, but I have thought. Elizabeth, listen to me. Christ nailed up might be more than a symbol of all pain. He might, in very truth, contain all pain. And a man standing on a hilltop with his arms outstretched, a symbol of the symbol. He, too, might be a reservoir of all the pain that ever was. For a moment she broke into his thinking, crying, Joseph, I'm afraid. And then his thought went on, listen, Elizabeth, don't be afraid. I will tell you, I have thought without words. Now let me grope a moment among the words, tasting them, trying them. This is a space between the real and the clean, unwavering, real, undistorted by the senses. Here is a boundary. Yesterday we were married, and it was no marriage. This is our marriage, through the pass, entering the passage like sperm and egg that have become a single unit of pregnancy. This is a symbol of the undistorted real. I have a moment in my heart, different in shape, in texture, in duration from any other moment. Why, Elizabeth, this is all marriage that has ever been contained in our moment. And he said in his mind, Christ is his little time on the nails carried within his body, all the suffering that ever was, and in him it was undistorted. He had been upon a star, and now the hills rushed back and robbed him of his aloneness and of his naked thinking. His arms and hands felt heavy and dead, hanging like weights on thick cords from the shoulders that were tired of supporting them. Elizabeth saw how his mouth had gone loose with hopelessness, and how his eyes had lost the red gleaming for a moment before. She cried, Joseph, what is it you want? What are you asking me to do? Twice he tried to answer, but a thickness in his throat prohibited speech. He coughed the passage free. I want to go through the pass, he said hoarsely. I'm afraid, Joseph. I don't know why, but I'm terribly afraid. He broke his lethargy then and coiled one of the swinging weights around her waist. There's nothing to be afraid of, dear. This is nothing. I've been far too much alone. It seems to mean something to me to go through the pass with you. She shivered against him and looked fearfully at the dismal blue shadow of the pass. I'll go, Joseph, she said miserably. I'll have to go. But I'll be leaving myself behind. I'll think of myself standing here looking through at the new one who will be on the other side. She remembered sharply how she had served cambric tea in tiny tin cups to 3 little girls, how they had reminded each other, we're ladies now. Ladies always hold their hands like this. And she remembered how she had tried to catch her doll's dream in a handkerchief. Joseph, she said, it's a bitter thing to be a woman. I'm afraid to be. Everything I've been or thought of will stay outside the pass. I'll be a grown woman on the other side. I thought it might come gradually. This is too quick. And she remembered how her mother said, when you're big, Elizabeth, you'll know hurt, but it won't be the kind of hurt you think. It'll be a hurt that can't be reached with a curing kiss. I'll go now, Joseph, she said quietly. I've been foolish. You'll have to expect so much foolishness from me. The weight left Joseph then. His arm tightened about her waist, and he urged her forward tenderly. She knew, although her head was bent, how he gazed down on her and how his eyes were gentle. They walked slowly through the pass, in the blue shade of it. Joseph laughed softly. There may be pains more sharp than delight, Elizabeth, like sucking hot peppermint that burns your tongue. The bitterness of being a woman may be an ecstasy. His voice ceased, and their footsteps rang on the stone road and clashed back and forth between the cliffs. Elizabeth closed her eyes, relying on Joseph's arm to guide her. She tried to close her mind, to plunge it into darkness, but she heard the angry whisper of the monolith in the river, and she felt the stone chill in the air. And then the air grew warm. There was no longer rock under her feet. Her eyelids turned black-red, then yellow-red over her eyes. Joseph stopped and drew her tightly against his side. Now we are through, Elizabeth. Now it is done. She opened her eyes and looked about on the closed valley. The land was dancing in the shimmer of the sun, and the trees, clannish, Clannish little families of white oaks stirred slightly under the wind that brought excitement to a sloping afternoon. The village of Our Lady was before them, houses brown with weathering and green with rose vines, picket fences burning with a soft fire of nasturtiums. Elizabeth cried out sharply with relief. "I've been having a bad dream. I've been asleep. I'll forget the dream now. It wasn't real." Joseph's eyes were radiant. "It's not so bitter, then, to be a woman?" he asked. "It isn't any different. Nothing seems changed. I hadn't realized how beautiful the valley is." "Wait here," he said. "I'll go back and bring the horses through." But when he was gone, Elizabeth cried sadly, for she had a vision of a child in short starched skirts with pigtails down her back, who stood outside the pass and looked anxiously in, stood on one foot and then on the other, hopped nervously and kicked a stone into the stream. For a moment the vision waited, as Elizabeth remembered, waiting on a street corner for her father, and then the child turned miserably away and walked slowly toward Monterey. Elizabeth was sorry for her, for it's a bitter thing to be a child, she thought. There are so many clean new surfaces to scratch. Oh. I can never get through this book without crying. Never. Oh my God. Anyway. The politics, right? The layers of politics with religion. So deep. And still so relevant today.